Hello, are you fed up with the REST API paradigm? Well, I am, so I made Socio. It is a WebSocket-based real-time duplex front-end and back-end syncing API paradigm, framework, or library. Essentially, you can do SQL queries on the front end, and for example here, a single query just once, and receive its result from the backend, from your backend database, which can be whatever, like here in the demo, I'm using SQLite 3, but you can hook up Postgres or Mongo or whatever you like. And this kind of query you could do with the REST API by just setting up like an endpoint on your backend web server with a specific URL and just do a JSON post request, and then it does the fetch on the DB interface, and then that returns a value back to the API endpoint, and then that forwards the response back to web client like a browser. But that's a lot of work and a lot of syncing of states and stuff. So instead in Socio, you can just write these SQL queries on the front end where they should logically sit, because that's what consumes their data. And you can just subscribe to these queries so that whenever things, for example, on this table change because of whatever reason on the back end, all of the clients will get notifications from the server that the value has changed and what it has changed to. So for example, let's try inserting something into the users, like a new user. Let's insert Bob. So we have currently this subscription, this other subscription, and then a server prop that I'll get to in a moment. And we can see that both of these received updates. This one didn't change because it only looks for a dynamic SQL property where the name is equal to John. We have only one John. Let's insert another one. Let's give him a different number, like 12. All right, so now we see that there's a John. We received again 2 updates. So for example, for this subscription and for this subscription right here. So now that we see there are 2 Johns and there are 2 Johns in here as well. Isn't that automagical? That is amazing. We'll take a look at the server setup in a moment, but basically all the logic's happening on the front end. And it's also safe. And we'll get to that in a moment as well, because the SQL that's actually being sent is completely encrypted. And I'll talk about that more a little bit later. In addition to SQL, the library also currently supports something that I call server props. And you can subscribe to them, you can query them, so like getters, setters. It's essentially just a JavaScript object that sits on the back end under some kind of name. And any client can subscribe, get, or set these values. So for this demonstration, I will actually pull up 2 tabs because that will make this a lot more impressive. So here, by the way, I can also insert another Bob, let's say Bob2, give him some kind of number. Okay, that makes things overflow. You can see that both clients received these updates. They're both on the localhost 5000. And so you can see they both received their updates, and you can see the little toasts as well. So let's try updating the server prop in the same way. Let's give it some kind of new color. I don't know, that, sure. Set it, and you see both instances updated. They received a server pushed update to the data, keeping your front end and back end completely synced at all times. So let's actually take a look at the code of how you can use this thing. So I'm using SvelteKit here as a full stack framework, and this is the main index page that you saw back there, and this is the Svelte component for it. So it starts with a script where I can just execute some JavaScript, or in this case TypeScript, because the library is built in TypeScript. And then down below here is the HTML, and I just put the variables and states inside of the HTML there. So the important bit here is that we import the Socio client and instantiate it here, and we tell it to start a connection or try to connect to this address. This address is the Socio server that is launched together with SvelteKit on the backend when it starts up. We'll take a look at that in a second. Once I've created this instance here, then on mount, Svelte has this nice lifecycle hook that gets called whenever this component is completely loaded or mounted onto the DOM. So essentially at that point, this component has all of its stuff loaded up and whatever. So at that point, you want to await ready to make sure that Socio has actually connected to this WebSocket here, whoops, because it might not connect to it, because it might not exist, but so here you will see if it is or isn't ready. You can call this multiple times. By the way, you can instantiate as many of these as you want on the client side. A little toast there. Then we have these 3 subscribes. So this subscribe just basically counts how many users there are, and it includes some dynamic data. This SQL here will get encrypted, as you saw. I will actually show that in the source code. But it also includes here dynamic data, which you're going to have to validate and secure from SQL injections yourself, either on the front end here, that's probably not a good idea, or on the back end in the query function, which I'll show in a second. The second subscribe actually gets all of the 3 fields from the users and displays them in the little table that I made there. And the third subscription here is the color, and I just named the server prop literally color. In all 3 of these cases, you see that in addition to the actual query that we want to subscribe to, we also pass in a callback, which in here is called an onUpdate, and there are more callbacks you can assign to this, that simply passes the result whenever the server pushes an update to the client. It'll be called in this function, and you can just do whatever you want with that. In all of these cases, I'm just assigning the local variable to whatever the newest state is. And on destroy, we just want to clean up and get rid of all the subscriptions. This HTML code, not that important, but there is a nice, neat syntax for Svelte called the await block, which means I can very nicely use the single time once executed query here to fetch a piece of data from the database just once and show a spinner whilst we're fetching that, and then show the actual result once we have it. You will also notice that all of these queries have this little -- socio tacked on at the end there. So what's that about? It is what I call a marker, and it's needed for the encryption process to happen correctly. There are more flags that you can add here, like auth and perm. So auth meaning that the user has to authenticate in order to actually execute this, and that check is performed on the back end. And a client can receive authentication by simply doing authenticate and pass in stuff like, I don't know, email, password. You can make up that stuff yourself. This will be passed to you on the back end, and then you can decide to either authenticate or not authenticate the client once he asks for it. And the permission is checking that this user currently has a permission to do some kind of action on some kind of table. So in a similar fashion, you can ask permission for a, give me the hints please, for the verb like select insert, and then like a table name. And again, it's up to the backend to actually grant the client access to these things. So then let's take a look at the actual backend of the setup there. It looks kind of lengthy, but that's just all boilerplate. Mainly we want to import these 2 things, the secure and the core. So the server and the security, because we want to encrypt the SQL queries. You're almost always going to want to do that. So here's where it just sets up the table and inserts some dummy data in there. The important bits here are the query wrap. So you're going to want to get some kind of raw query function from your database interface. For example, here SQLize has this raw query function, and I wrapped that myself because I receive different parameters from the socio library, and I need to feed those in correctly into the raw query function. So I just simply feed that into the SQLize and return the result of that. So here's a very simple example with your Postgres or MongoDB or whatever database you're using. This might be a longer function, but essentially you instantiate the socio server and pass it what port it's going to run on. You can actually hook it up to be on the same HTTP port as your web server. For example, if you're running a HTTP server with the node HTTP class or an Express.js server, you can actually hook that up here to run on the same thing, so you're not running 2 servers at the same time. And some other options here, you just pass that in. At that point, you have it created, and the first thing I do with it is that I register a prop called color, give it an initial value, and then another function here that I call an assigner, which basically gets called whenever a new value is proposed to be set by some kind of client. So to prevent clients from just putting whatever they want in there, I perform some checks to make sure it's a string, that it's exactly length 7, and it matches this regex to know that it's a valid hex color code. And then I manually set the color prop to the new value that is being proposed. Another thing you'll notice here is I'm instantiating socio security, and pretty much all you have to give it is the private key that you're going to be using for encryption. Don't use this, generate your own. And then you're just going to put that in here as an option, and that is going to perform all the magic for you to decrypt the SQL queries. Let's take a look at that on the browser again. So here, looking at the raw sources panel, the files that were actually served to the browser on a local dev server here from the page, you can see here's an example of one of my queries being executed, and right here on the browser it sits as this absolute gibberish that nobody could understand. And likewise, if you see the printouts of all the things that are happening, for example, in SQL query happening here, you can see the same string here. It's absolute gibberish and nobody can tamper with it and nobody can read it. So it's all completely secure that it sits on the front end. How does this happen? If we take a look at the Vite config, because this is SvelteKit with Vite as the build tool, I have included into the library a simple plugin that you can include into your plugins list, where you again give the same secure key, and it will auto-encrypt all of your Socio SQL queries, so you don't have to worry about it. It happens at build time, so it'll happen once per build. So here's the actual plugin, no need to really worry about that. It looks at these file extensions here, and it will encrypt the source code of those. The actual class is down here, and you can take a look at how it works and stuff. It uses the AES 256-bit GCM mode, which guarantees confidentiality, can't read the message, integrity, can't alter the message or mutate it, and authenticity, which means that the crypt actually includes an auth tag with which I can understand if the server that built the encryptions were the ones that are actually receiving the same crypt message. So foreign encrypted messages won't be executed either. So that's about it for this show and tell. Here's the GitHub for it. Go ahead and check that out. Check out the source code. Check out the other demo links and simple documentation of how to use this in your own small little project. It should be ready for that. And here's the npm package where you can see and quickly install. Thank you for your interest.